Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I know we're having super engaging conversations here this morning. I'm sure just reminiscing what happened from yesterday. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to all who participated yesterday on day one. We had such a great set of conversations and panels, so that was fantastic. I hope you had a really restful evening and that you were able to decompress from the events of yesterday and that you had some good food. Good morning to our virtual attendees as well. Thank you for participating. And just to recap, for those who did not make it yesterday, we did have quite an engaging conversation. We started with looking at the gaps in evidence for inclusion of pregnant and lactating people in clinical trials. And then we were able to, throughout the day, to really get different perspectives from different stakeholders, including patients who were here in the room, and including also healthcare providers, our federal agencies, academicians, researchers, and sponsors. We had a very fruitful conversation on the liability concerns, and we ended up the day also with very actionable items that came out of the breakout group discussions. So we are hopeful that all of those things that you really thought about yesterday that we're going to be putting into place, and that we all, I think my takeaway was also that we all have a responsibility and a role within our functions, within what we do, to really be the conduit to all the change that we're really hoping to have. So for today, so we are going to start by looking at the progress and having a conversation about the progress towards implementing the PREG-like recommendations, and then we are going to go into case studies. Yesterday I mentioned that we're going to do 2 case studies, one on mental health and one on COVID-19 vaccine, and obviously all related to how do we do evidence generation for inclusion of pregnant women in those cases. And then we're going to end up the day with the new approaches to generate evidence for treating pregnant and lactating persons. So that I'm really excited for what the day 2 is going to have. And then we're going to wrap it up about 11:50. We want you to get out of here at a decent time so you can catch your flights or your trains, whatever. So without further ado, I want to introduce, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Diana Bianchi, who is the director of the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and a senior investigator in the Center for Precision Health Research at the National Human Genome Research Institute. Both are part of the NIH. She is responsible for leading a large portfolio that focuses on children, reproductive biology, and pregnancy, and physical and intellectual disabilities. Thank you so much, Dr. Bianchi. She is joining us virtually, so she's going to start her remarks, and then we're going to go into a conversation. Take it away, Dr. Bianchi.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sylvester. So I am getting a message that I cannot start screen sharing. Well, okay, there we go. I think we will see if I can share now. Perfect. And let's go to presentation. Is that in presentation mode there? It looks like it is. Okay, hopefully if things advance, we'll be good to go. Well, thank you, Dr. Sylvester and the Academy for inviting me to share with you progress towards including pregnant and lactating people in clinical trials. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you yesterday, but we've had our advisory council this week and also some presentations on our new Improve initiative on maternal health. I'm sure that PREG-LAC came up yesterday, and probably many of you, if not all of you, know that in 2016, Congress established PREG-LAC as part of the 21st Century Cures Act to identify and address gaps in knowledge regarding safe and effective therapies and vaccines. They used the term women at the time, but now we are using pregnant and lactating people. And the picture on the right shows the members of the task force who encompass multiple NIH institutes, representatives from the CDC, the FDA, AHRQ, HRSA, HHS, the VA, multiple professional societies, representatives from industry, academia, and nonprofit organizations. NIH was directed to be the lead, and Dr. Collins asked NICHD within NIH to lead the task force. The task force met multiple times between 2016 and 2018, and on time, the PregLac workforce delivered a report to Congress and to the HHS secretary that included 15 recommendations. And that's what I'm going to talk with you about today, what we've done with those 15 recommendations. However, importantly, we did not want this report to sit on a shelf and gather dust. So we asked the secretary to extend the charter to give him and everybody else guidance on how do we implement these 15 recommendations. So in 2020, during the pandemic, in fact, our last meeting as a task force was in February 2020, just before the pandemic. But by the summer of 2020, we issued the implementation plan. The charter has expired, but we continue to work on this. And I want to assure you that as director of NICHD, this is a very, very high priority. Next slide. So the key recommendations included, and this has become our mantra, to protect pregnant people through research instead of from research, which has been the predominant cultural idea. We need to change the existing culture that has limited scientific knowledge of therapeutic product safety, effectiveness, and dosing for pregnant and lactating people. The existing culture aims to, quote unquote, protect people, but in fact, as I will argue later on, I think it harms people. Another recommendation included removing pregnant women as a vulnerable population through the common rule, then to expand the workforce of clinicians and researchers who have expertise in obstetric and lactation pharmacology and therapeutics, and to the extent possible, remove the regulatory barriers. The recommendations, as well as the implementation report, are all available for anybody who wants to see them online. And if you just Google NIH PregLac, it'll take you to the PregLac homepage where you can download the reports. So in the interest of time, I have grouped the recommendations where they do somewhat flow together, and then I can describe the related actions. So recommendations 1, 2, 9, and 11 all had to do with including and integrating pregnant and lactating people in clinical research agendas, as you've been talking about in the past day, increasing the quantity and quality of research, develop programs that would facilitate the research and that would also result in development of therapeutics and new therapeutic products, and then to leverage established and support new infrastructures and collaborations to perform research in these populations. So in the couple of years when we've been a little
Recording in progress.
When we've been a little bit distracted by the pandemic, we nonetheless have moved things forward. And the biggest program with the biggest amount of funding is the so-called Maternal Pediatric Precision and Therapeutics Hub, otherwise known as Imprint. And this is aiming to serve as a national resource for expertise in maternal and pediatric therapeutics to conduct and foster therapeutics-focused research in obstetrics, lactation, and pediatrics, while enhancing the inclusion of people who happen to be pregnant or lactating, but also have disabilities. In addition, in partnership, we have for many years funded the Maternal Fetal Medicines Unit Network, which has added during the pandemic, studying the efficacy of antivirals and other therapeutics for women with COVID-19. So what is the Imprint Hub? It's really, as I said, it's a resource, it's a service center and a science catalyst that is aiming to address the underrepresentation of women and children in clinical trials. It enhances the availability of knowledge, regulatory science, and drug development tools. It catalyzes and accelerates maternal and pediatric therapeutics towards precision medicine. It allows synergy with other resources and networks, such as the MFMU. And the goal is really to facilitate safer, more inclusive, and more cost-effective trials. And one of the grantees, Dr. Chambers, I believe she's participating in this conference and will speak later today. So she obviously is much more of an expert about this than I am, but she and her group proposed to study the effects of maternal antibiotics on breast milk and infant outcomes. So they're developing and validating novel assays and models to describe and predict maternal and infant antibiotic pharmacokinetics during breastfeeding, and the impact of maternal antibiotics on establishing normal infant microbiome and gut metabolome, and then also to study the potential downstream effects of antibiotic exposure on infant immune function and cytochrome P450 drug metabolizing enzymes. So hopefully she'll have a chance to mention a little bit more about this later on. At Vanderbilt, there is a group that is looking at maternal and pediatric precision and therapeutics within the context of neonatal opioid withdrawal syndrome. This is a community-engaged approach to illuminate knowledge, attitudes, and priorities for pharmacogenomics. And they are using their very well-developed EHR system to validate pharmacogenomic associations using EHR phenotyping. So they're looking at phenotype and genotype. And then particularly, they are identifying and quantifying variants with unknown function in diverse populations of individuals. So that's where we put most of our funding for those recommendations. Now, with regard to expanding the workforce of clinicians and research investigators with expertise in obstetric and lactation pharmacology and therapeutics, we have multiple training and career development awards that include research on pregnant lactating people. They're listed at this link, but an important part of the Imprint Hub is to focus on educating the biomedical community. So it's really meant to be an educational resource as well, and to be a place where investigators or clinicians can go to get more information. Recommendation 7 was to reduce liability to facilitate an evidence base for new therapeutic products. And we are funding a congressionally mandated study, a different activity with NASM to convene a panel with specific legal, ethical, regulatory, and policy expertise to develop a framework for addressing medical, legal, and liability issues when planning or conducting research specific to pregnant people and lactating people. And we're hoping that maybe some of the current discussions in the workshop yesterday and today will also address some of the liability issues. Recommendation 10 was to implement a proactive approach to protocol development and study design to include pregnant women and lactating women in clinical research. Like I said, our MFMU network has included the study of the efficacy of antivirals and other therapeutics for pregnant women with COVID-19. Specifically, there's been a whole study on remdesivir in pregnancy. The MFMU completed the tranexamic acid study for the prevention of obstetrical hemorrhage after cesarean delivery, testing whether in pregnancies with cesareans, giving tranexamic acid following cord clamping can reduce maternal deaths and the need for blood transfusions. And we are partnering with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to assess globally in low and middle income countries whether a single oral dose of azithromycin during labor will reduce the risk of maternal and infant bacterial infection and death. And these are just some examples. We also have open grant solicitations on translational research in maternal and pediatric pharmacology and therapeutics. And indeed, we have a branch in our extramural research division that is called the Obstetric and Pediatric Pharmacology and Therapeutics branch, and they are really taking the lead on implementing a number of these recommendations. Recommendation 12 was to utilize and improve existing resources for data to inform the evidence and provide a foundation for research in this area. I can show you here, and this is important just to remind everybody that NICHD is not responsible for implementing all of the recommendations, but we recognize that we have a responsibility because this is a very important issue that aligns with our mission and vision, and we were also asked to lead the workforce. So the Office of the Secretary's Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Trust Fund, or OSPC-ORTF, has funded projects to improve the electronic health record data for research on maternal health and pregnancy, as well as linking maternal records to baby records. We are working with them on an EHR data infrastructure to address severe maternal morbidity and mortality, and again, understand the effects on the baby, for example, of severe maternal morbidity. The CDC has the MATLINK program. They also have enhanced surveillance of maternal health clinical practice and outcomes with the federally qualified health centers, EHRs, visit data. And lastly, we have DASH, which is the NICHD Data and Specimen Hub that has grown over the last few years. It's a centralized resource that allows researchers to share and address de-identified data from studies that have been funded by NICHD. And it serves as a portal for requesting biospecimens from selected studies. This is a great resource, and it really helps with training because it eliminates all that time required to get a protocol through the IRB, to recruit participants. We have many people downloading the data from these studies, many of which do involve pregnancy and lactation. We do have quite a number of biospecimens, and it does include breast milk. It's very important to prepare for future pandemics. We wrote, so myself, Lisa Kaiser, and Allison Cernich wrote a viewpoint commentary in JAMA that was published a year ago. I think it was expressing our frustration that here we had all these recommendations. The perfect use case would have been to follow them in order to be able to give meaningful information to pregnant and lactating people at the beginning of the pandemic when vaccines first became available. And as we said, our goal was to change the culture to protect people through research instead of from research. And yet pregnant people were forgotten, essentially, in terms of including them in the initial vaccine clinical trials. It was a public health emergency. I understand that. We can't go backwards, but I think we need to look in the future and say, we know that other pandemics will likely occur, or at least epidemics will likely occur. Where do pregnant people and lactating people fit in the ecosystem? So we need a plan, and I'm happy to talk about that during the Fireside chat. So just a couple of slides now on what either hasn't been accomplished yet to date or what is really not in NICHD's level of responsibilities. So importantly, one of the recommendations was to remove regulatory barriers to research in pregnant women. And I'm happy to say that in 2019, pregnant women were removed as an explicit example of a vulnerable population in 45 CFR 46 by the HHS Office for Human Research Protection. Despite that, there are several IRBs that don't realize that yet, and they are still highly protective of pregnant people, as they should be, but they shouldn't be obstructive. To my knowledge, and I do believe that Lynn Yao, who was a member of the task force discussions, is in the audience, and to my knowledge, the FDA harmonization with the common rule, which was also called out as a recommendation, has not occurred yet. So maybe she can address that. And then lastly, here are areas where it's really not NICHD's focus. We're a research organization. So for example, creating a public awareness campaign to engage the public and healthcare providers in research on pregnant and lactating women, that is something that we could do in partnership with other agencies, for example. Many of these have to do with communication. And again, our focus is to fund the research and then work with other partners to communicate the results and put them into action. And then there were some industry recommendations as well, develop separate programs to study therapeutic products used off patent in pregnant and lactating people using the NIH Best Pharmaceutical Act for Children as a model. And lastly, to optimize registries for pregnancy and lactation, because pregnant people do take medications, but they take them without evidence. So with that, I'm going to end my slides, and hopefully Dr. Sylvester and I can have a fireside chat.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bianchi. It is really uplifting to see that there has been so much progress since the implementation, since PregLact. And that there are some actions that are really happening and that people are conducting this research as we speak. And one question, I know that we won't have a lot of time for questions, and I apologize in advance to the virtual people because they probably want to have more conversation with you. But what can we as community of researchers, healthcare providers, industry can do to collect additional data on pregnant and lactating people to inform decision-making that can impact clinical care?
Thank you for the question. I think there's a tremendous amount of information out there, but it's not being collected. So we know that pregnant people or lactating people are taking these medications, but we don't have a large-scale registry, for example. I think the solution lies very much in a way similar to what's being done in the EU with the Conception Project, where in a very short time, they were able to, with the Innovations in Medicine Institute and EU funding, put together bioinformatics systems to capture information across Europe. And they've got the additional issue of multiple languages, multiple different systems, but in a period of 2 to 3 years, they were able to create essentially a major data set that can comb through large-scale electronic health records to link information on pregnancy outcomes, infant outcomes, lactation, and the medications that the pregnant people are taking. Having been involved in a lot of discussions on big data analysis, data science, data sharing as a result of all of the COVID studies at NIH, I know we have the ability to do that. I'm not volunteering the funding to do that right now, but I think that this is something that would be feasible and it would be low-hanging fruit. And I think it would be able to provide some important information, at least about common medications that pregnant people take that probably don't have adverse effects, and that might be reassuring to pregnant lactating people.
Absolutely. So that is a good way to, at least there is a model that other countries, other geographies have used. So when the funding is available, at least, we know that there is a model that can be used too here in the U.S.
I can put the reference in the chat box too when we're done. And I would encourage, I can stay on for a little while so people can ask questions in the chat box if that's easier.
Yes. And you touch upon a little bit about COVID-19, the COVID-19 experience. So using that experience of the COVID-19 vaccine in pregnant and lactating people as an example, how can we get information that will be more informative and useful for future pandemics? We know that we're still in the COVID-19 pandemic. We know it's not unrealistic to think that there may be another one. So what can we do? What can we learn from this case and then move forward?
Yeah, that's so important. I mean, every night when I go to bed, I think about the nearly 300 pregnant women who died because of severe COVID, because pregnant people are more severely affected with COVID. And had there been more information available earlier on, I don't know that these women would have been vaccinated, but I think many would have been more reassured about getting vaccinated. So what could we have done? Well, there were very limited pregnant rodent studies done on a preclinical basis. So I would say that all of these new vaccines, all of these new therapeutics need to include pregnant animal preclinical models, for one. I think there is a lot of information available on pregnant people with flu vaccines, now with the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. Somebody needs to take a big look at those data to be able to create a framework for future vaccines and therapeutics. We need to be prepared.
Absolutely. And then just in the spirit of time, if there was only one thing you hope that people in the audience today do as a result of our conversation for the last day and now, what would it be?
I would say that pregnant people need to be treated exactly the same as non-pregnant people. They don't need to be excluded. They need to be thoughtfully included. I'm not saying to be reckless and not to consider the effects on the fetus or on the mother, but by excluding them and putting them at the back of the line, we know that there's harm being done. So we all need to be more proactive. I'm thrilled that this conference is happening, but everyone, as you said earlier, everyone has a responsibility to advocate for these populations. And if we don't speak up, it's not going to happen because of this, traditional culture. But changing culture is not easy. So it really requires a lot of people to be involved. And that's really, I think, the most important thing, to remind everyone that there are 200 million pregnant women per year in the world. And the medications that they're taking, very little, about 5% of them have been studied specifically for use in pregnancy. So this is a massive problem, but we're not going to change it unless we all work together. And that's why we have made outreach to the EU as well, to see, are there areas in which we can work together.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bianchi, for your time, for the insightful information you shared with us today. And I'm really glad to hear that you are, spearheading all this progress and that you are really behind all these initiatives. So thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. I'm going to join on the main link, and I'll put that Conception EU project link in the chat box.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we are inviting the next session, so the case studies, the lessons learned in trials in mental health and COVID-19.